Thank you so much, Pastor Yumi. I'm very moved by what you said. Yeah. It is true, though. The chairs that we had back then were not like this. Yeah. So I thought maybe you had the new carpets and new chairs just for me today. So thank you. I had to laugh when Pastor Dan was talking about the women's ministry meeting and that you're not going to be you're not going to be recruited to be on a committee. Because it reminded me when I was the pastor of a small church in San Mateo. It was a really small church, so everybody had to be involved. So one day I called one of the members of the church, and as soon as she heard my voice, she recognized me. She said, "What are you going to ask me about now? What are you going to ask me to do now?" I hadn't realized that every time I call her, I'm asking her to do this or do that. But thankfully, your church pastors aren't going to do that to you. You can just volunteer on your own. So, as Pastor Yumi mentioned, that I'm really honored to be able to open this new series based on the Stations of the Resurrection. And this is the first image we'll be using today. But you probably are more familiar with the Stations of the Cross, right? And in fact, I heard that you did the Stations of the Cross on a Good Friday service not long ago. So you're much more familiar with the Stations of the Cross. And it's based, the Stations of the Cross, based on 14 different events leading up to Jesus being laid into the tomb. It begins with him being condemned to die, and then it ends with him being buried in the tomb. In Latin, the term for Stations of the Cross is Via Crucis, which means way of the cross. Now, the Stations of the Resurrection in Latin is Via Lucis, which means way of light, which I find really fascinating. It's the way of light. And the Stations of the Resurrection are meant to complement the Stations of the Cross. So there are also 14 different events surrounding the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it begins with the resurrection of Christ, and it ends on the day of Pentecost. Do you remember what the day of Pentecost is? The birthday of the church. So it ends with the birthday of the church. So each speaker during this series, Stations of the Resurrection, we've been given a resource, and we'll be referring to this resource, and it was done by Scott Erickson. Scott Erickson is an author, and he, actually an artist, but he authored a devotional based on the Stations of the Resurrection. And for each station, he included a piece of art depicting that specific event, and then he provides a theme for that particular day. And so today, the theme is Risen. And listen to God's word for you this morning, coming from the Gospel of Luke. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but he has risen." To illustrate today's passage, Scott Erickson gave us this drawing. I think we have that. We saw this earlier. Now, as I was sharing with Pastor Rebecca when we were talking about this series, I told her, I'm really not good at interpreting poems, and I'm not good at interpreting art. But the good thing about art and poetry is that it's supposed to elicit your own personal response, correct? It's very subjective. So I want to ask you, and please shout it out loud. What do you see looking at this image? A tree? A heart? A heart. Oh, wow. I didn't see that before. Wow. Good. What else do you see? Tree growing out of the heart? A face looking up. A face looking up. Eyeball. An eyeball. An eyeball. CBS eyeball.
Coffin.
A coffin. Yeah, that's a very prominent part of this drawing. Well, here's what I see. And I'm so glad I heard you, because I didn't even see the heart.
Yeah.
It might change my sermon now now that we see. Okay. So this is what I see, and I'll do a little bit of interpretation about what I see in this drawing. The first thing I see, to me, is the casket. It's obvious, right? I mean, I think it's obvious that that's a casket. But there's also, and this casket to me, any casket to me, kind of represents, of course, death. And there's sort of a finality to death. And there's an ending in death, okay? But there's also a cross on this casket. And to me, of course, that cross represents Jesus' death on the cross, right? His crucifixion. But this cross is on this casket, I think, because it represents the fact that Jesus was buried, physically buried, and put away in a tomb. So this casket, to me, also is the tomb where Jesus was buried. But out of this tomb, which is an open casket, that's significant to me. It's an open casket. And coming out of this casket, springing forth from this casket, is this beautiful tree. Well, it's black and white, but still to me, it's a beautiful tree. And that tree to me represents life, new life. It's like springtime. When springtime comes forth, it represents new life to us, new beginnings and new possibilities. And finally, the shadowy figure. Most people would say that this is Jesus looking to heaven. And it could be, of course, based on your own interpretation. But to me, this figure is the figure of a woman. And to me, it's based on the context of today's passage. Okay? And this figure represents the women at the tomb, that they had come to anoint Jesus' body. So let me start with the casket, or in my interpretation, the tomb. As I mentioned, when I think of death, I think of an ending, or even something very final, a finality, as though something has come to a complete and utter close, an utter halt. Physical death means life has come to an end, and that there is nothing to look forward to. And in fact, the people mourning the person who has died feel like there's a large void in their life. And for a long time, they feel like they can't fill that void. There are all other kinds of death besides physical death, like the death of our dreams. How many of us have had our dreams squashed, And that can leave us with a sense of helplessness and a sense of hopelessness. It's like what happened to us and to the world in the year 2020. You remember that? 2020. It came upon us and it changed us forever. It felt very scary at the time. COVID was not a joke. It was very real. And none of us could have been blamed if in that time of COVID, when we felt helpless and when we watched the news and saw all those caskets, how terrifying that was and how hopeless we felt around that time. You remember that we had to shelter in place? Of course you remember that. You also might remember that because we had to shelter in place, we couldn't gather together in large groups. We couldn't come to church. We couldn't come to church and be together as a family of Christ. And if we came down with COVID-19 ourselves, we had to be isolated. We had to be quarantined. And the worst thing is if you came down with COVID and you had a family, you couldn't even go outside, open your bedroom door. They had to put food at your door so you can get the food, but you wouldn't poison them with COVID yourself. But you know what? We were fortunate that eventually they were able to not just name this disease, but scientists were also able to create a vaccine for it, right? So slowly things began to turn around and the world started to spring back to life. But even still, COVID-19 reverberates with us even today. It reminded me, as I was preparing this message and thinking about 2020, it reminded me of a time in my own life where it's kind of hard for me to even talk about this, but I trust you with this. There was a time in my life when I was feeling very much in despair. So many things were happening in my life. I just couldn't get a handle on myself and get a handle on the things that were happening around me and inside of me. And I began to isolate myself, which those of you who know me well would say, well, that's not him. He never isolates himself. He always likes to be in a crowd. He always likes to be with people. But at that time, I didn't feel like that. But once I started withdrawing, I realized, man, I need help. I need help. So I went to see a therapist. So it must have been around the second or third session with this therapist. The therapist said to me, you are what we would describe as clinically depressed. And you are not the first, nor will you be the last to receive this diagnosis. What? What? Whoa, me? Clinically depressed? I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I knew what it meant. And something inside of me just sort of broke. And he asked me, do you want medication to help you with this? And I said, you know what? I don't think so. Because in the moment he said it, the moment he named it, it was like something opened inside of me, and I felt like, I can do this. Somehow I know I can do this, and I can get out of this. That diagnosis shifted the way I could see things. Does that make sense to you? Oh, good. I was worried that it might not. So from there, for the next few sessions, the therapist and I talked about some specific things that had led me down that rabbit hole of darkness. Some of the events in my life that led me down that rabbit hole of darkness. But we also spent a lot of time talking about tools to deal with my sadness and to deal with my despair. But you know what? Looking back at that today, even in reflection, I had to go through it. I had to go through the darkness, the dark night of the soul, as some people call it. And I realized that coming out of the darkness and dealing with all that stuff inside of me was helpful for me because I came out of that a different person. And dare I say, an even better person. I'm not sure about that better person part, but I think so. Now, you may be experiencing a sort of dying or death because of some circumstances in your life. You may be dealing with some darkness because of some unresolved feelings or consequences or relationships in your life. You are not the first, you are not the last to be experiencing a kind of death and dying. But you know, the tendency for most of us is to bury it, right? We sort of bury all of that stuff and we don't tell anybody about it. We think we can do it on our own. We can't truly deal with our woundedness, though, until we have named it, until we have acknowledged it and recognized it. Only by naming what we're experiencing can we then begin the process of coming out of the darkness and begin the process of healing. Choosing to deal with our woundedness opens the casket, so to speak. It opens the tomb. And then we have a real chance of coming out of that darkness and coming back to life. Not necessarily being the same person that we were before, but a different person and hopefully a better person. That is why, can you put that image back up there for me again? That is why the tree springing forth in that casket in this drawing this morning is so profound to me. By naming our wounds and identifying what is causing our pain and choosing to deal with it all is how we put to death the power these things have over us. And once we put to death that power, then springs forth the life that we seek and the life that we need. So rather than dwelling in hopelessness because of the pain that we're experiencing, we see new possibilities. Our soul awakens, and particularly if we turn to God, our vision for ourselves and for life itself becomes clearer and newer and brighter, I think. I appreciate what Scott Erickson says about the resurrection and about the word risen that is used in our scripture passage this morning. He writes, risen means to stand back up, inferring that there is a moment before when we will find ourselves taken down. Death, ultimately, yes, but maybe we can stand back up from less ultimate aspects of life, like receiving a punch or a put down, a demotion, a setback, an illness, or a broken heart. And he goes on to say about resurrection, resurrection was something that happened to Jesus. It says, he has been raised. And the cherub proclaimed, not he raised himself by his intense willpower. Resurrection isn't about bootstrapping your way out of a tough situation. And that was a very new insight to me. He said that it wasn't the fact that Jesus himself, by his own willpower, raised him out of the grave. Someone else did it. Something else did it that brought him back to life. You know, we all want to believe that we, on our own, by ourselves, solve our own problems. We want to really believe that we did it ourselves. And I think in our society, we've been impacted by this ideology. Pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. Pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. And we have heard that one before, haven't we? I'm sure some of us have been told that too. Pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. Our Western world works so much on the principle of the individual that we neglect the need that we have for others, and we neglect the idea that we really need community. Not only that, but we think everyone, because of our individualized thinking in society, we believe that everyone should be able to handle their own stuff and get themselves out of trouble. How often have we heard this said about the poor and the marginalized in our society? Why can't you pick yourself up like I did? Pick yourself up by your own bootstraps and make something of yourself. We don't consider all the obstacles that stand in the way of the poor and the marginalized. We who have everything we need mistakenly believe, I am who I am, and I have what I have because I put in the effort. I did all the work. I am the one who accomplished everything to get where I am, so you should be able to do the same. When we believe that narrative, we forget all the people who opened doors for us. We forget about all the favorable circumstances that were in our lives that paved the way for us. The truth is, we needed scientists. We needed doctors and professionals, medical professionals, to create a new vaccine for COVID-19. We couldn't do it ourselves. We needed them. I needed my therapist to help me navigate my issues and to get me out of my negative thoughts and get me out of the doldrums, as it were. It's much better that we have other people that we can count on who can help us stand back up again rather than trying to do it ourselves. I'm a really big basketball fan. I love basketball. And when I lived in the Bay Area, I watched a lot of Golden State Warrior games. I'm really fortunate today because one of my friends, he subscribes to YouTube TV. So he put me on his family plan. And so now I watch Warrior games all the time live. Actually, I think it's illegal to put you on a plan because you're supposed to be in the same household, but don't tell anybody. But there's something I've noticed about basketball and basketball teams in the men's and the women's game. Whenever a player gets knocked down to the floor, Do you notice that all their teammates run and help the player up? And never once in watching basketball have I ever seen the guy or the woman on the floor refuse the hands of those who have come to pick him or her up. Never once have I seen them refuse. They stand back up with the help of others. So, if God gifts you with friends, family members, church members, whoever offers you a hand, don't refuse it. That's God's gift to you. Community is a gift to you to be picked up again. Regardless of what you're going through, you cannot go through it alone, and you shouldn't go through it alone. Let others be part of the party with you. On my bookshelves, in one of my bookcases, I have a copy of the First Nations version of the New Testament. And this is written from the cultural perspective of indigenous Native American peoples. And this is how they describe the resurrection. In verse 6 of our passage today, this is how it's written in the indigenous language. He, meaning Jesus, is not here. He has returned to life. He has returned to life. He has risen. That's what it means. He has returned to life. Listen, just because we have been hurt or we've been wounded in this life, it doesn't mean we have to stop living. You do not have to stop living, even if you've been wounded in some way. With the help of the Holy Spirit and the assistance of all of those people God has gifted you with, we can stand up again. We can stand up on some solid ground, always with hope, always with the fact that there are new possibilities, and dare I say it, there's a chance for a new life. Chance for new life. Now, one of the interesting details about that first resurrection morning that I find fascinating, that in each of the gospel accounts of that resurrection morning, the first ones to the tomb were women. Women. In some accounts in the Gospels, they're named, like in our passage today, later on they're named, but in some they're not named. But for sure, it was the women who came to the tomb. Now, here's the thing. The men were not there. The male disciples were not there. But they had logical reason for not being there. They were afraid that what happened to Jesus at the cross could happen to them. So they were in hiding. Now, to be honest, the women should have been in hiding too, because to be associated with Jesus meant, oh, you're a troublemaker. So you could be in trouble too. They could have been in trouble. But instead, even though they had some legitimate fears for staying in the shadows, they did not. They did not keep hiding themselves in the shadows. Instead, they came out hoping to anoint the body of Jesus. Now, eventually the male disciples will have their day in the sun. In fact, we know that most of the disciples were martyred because of their faith. But at least on this day, they were still in hiding. They were all traumatized, every one of them, the men and women. They were traumatized because they had seen Jesus mocked by a crowd that couldn't make up their minds about him. They had seen him beaten. And then, of course, the women in particular saw him on the cross, being crucified, a criminal's death. And so you can imagine their collective psyche and how fearful that could have made them. But none of that prevented the women from stepping out of the shadows, so to speak. They had come, as I mentioned, to anoint Jesus' body. And to anoint Jesus' body to them was a precious ritual, to be able to tend to the body of Jesus, which was not a glamorous thing for sure, but It was an act of love. To anoint his body was an act of love. Interesting. Always, it was the women who did the unglamorous things, tending to the bodies of their loved ones from birth to death and every day in between. Always attending to the wounds, to the needs, always healing and caring, and even in death, caring by anointing. Always expressing love in the most practical and yet very tender ways. These women would not let their grief and their fear and sadness keep them from loving their teacher, their Lord, and their friend. Now, it saddens me to think about how prominent a role women had in Jesus' life, and yet women in that day, and to be honest, even today to some degree, women were nearly invisible. In fact, when the women at the tomb went back to the other male disciples to tell these disciples what they had seen and experienced, in verse 11 of our passage today, it says this, "But these words," meaning the words of the women, "seemed to them," meaning the male disciples, "an idle tale, and they did not believe them." How would you feel? How would you feel? It is more than likely that the women actually knew that the words that they were going to tell the male disciples would be dismissed because they had been dismissed before. But they told their story anyway. They didn't give in to social mores or gendered expectations. They just told their story. Their story, in fact, of the resurrection changed the world. In 2021, I met a young girl named Mina Fedor, who is from Oakland. At the time, she was an 8th grader. And she had organized a youth movement among Asian American students, and they named it AAPI Youth Rising. AAPI, of course, stands for Asian American Pacific Islanders. It was in response to all the anti-Asian hate that was being spewed forth, not only in California, but all across the country because of COVID. She started the first chapter of AAPI Youth Rising in her own school. And from there are now 150 chapters of AAPI Youth Rising across 35 states. They created a curriculum. A one-day seminar on Asian American history, and it is now being presented across the country in middle and high schools. Mina and all the young people in that movement are, to me, powerful witnesses, undeniably committed and dedicated to educating the larger population about Asian Americans in general, but as well as increasing the awareness of the prejudice and the hate and the bias against Asian American communities. No one expects a teenager to use their voice for change and justice. We just don't see teenagers doing that for some reason. But that is exactly what Mina and her friends did. So let me close with this. Sometimes you may feel invisible. Sometimes you may feel dismissed, even by your closest friends, perhaps. You may feel that way. But tell your story anyway. Rise up. Rise up out of your fear. And use your story to help others gain new perspectives and perhaps a new life. Because your woundedness and your pain are in some ways the greatest tools for empathy. Because you know what it's like to have suffered and to be in pain. So rise up, use your voice, tell people the story of how God has helped you and been with you. Amen.